Hello, and welcome to another episode of Beyond Death, the podcast that isn't afraid to talk about death and the people who work with the deceased and their relatives. We are your hosts. I am Mark, I'm a radiographer, and I'm a lecturer in forensic radiographer. And with me today is
Lindsay. Hi, everybody. Good morning. I'm Lindsay. I'm a forensic radiographer of vintage years, and welcome and good morning.
And Lindsay. Who have we got with us today then?
We've got a very interesting person to podcast interview, Danielle Sharp. So Danielle has over 15 years' experience in preventing and responding to violence, abuse and harm. She has held senior roles in local authorities as strategic lead and commissioner, managing multi-million pound budgets for domestic abuse services. Nationally, she has led the Knowledge Hub at one of the UK's largest domestic abuse charities, overseeing an expert team and several national programmes, including the Leading Lights Service accreditation and the Home Office funded One Front Door pilot. She has worked extensively to improve responses to sexual exploitation and abuse, including through her previous role as an associate for Safe and Sound, in which she trained thousands of professionals and led participatory research with young people to review a children's social care strategy process for a city council. She is currently the founder and director of Centre for Safer Society, through which she undertakes research, strategy and scrutiny projects, including statutory domestic abuse related death reviews, which she will expand upon at depth later on so we can understand more fully about what she does. She has a BSc in psychology and she was appointed as practitioner in residence within the School of Policy and Global Affairs at London City St George's University. So I think I'm going to, after that very impressive bio, hand over to Mark to start the questions. Thank you, Mark.
Thank you, Lindsay. Well, hi, Danielle. And listening to that CV, I think it's going to be a really, really interesting podcast. It's a really unique and specific field. How and why did you become involved with it in the first place?
So when I first started my career, I worked with young people, and it was young people that at that time we described as disaffected or hard to reach, and we use other terms now, but essentially it was young people that were involved in crime or on the peripheral of being involved in crime. And I suppose I've kind of moved up the ecological framework, if you like, of working with individuals to then working with families. So I worked with families that were involved in criminal behaviour, and the government's then called Troubled Families, which is an absolutely awful term, programme where I worked with families that were kind of at the highest risk of becoming involved in harm. And from that really recognised, I suppose, that actually doing the work at an individual and a family level really isn't going to have the impact that I was hoping to have in terms of broader society. So from there, really, I started working in strategic roles and working with the systems, both micro systems, so working across local areas to develop strategies to reduce violence, abuse and harm, but then also working in kind of more international and national roles where we looked at macro systems, so thinking about how legislation, how policy and how things like that impact people getting involved in violence, abuse and harm. So it definitely wasn't, I'd say, an intentional path. One thing led to another, and I kind of wanted to have as broad an impact as possible. So yeah, it was a bit like following breadcrumbs, really.
Wow, that's really interesting. And I noticed that one of the things you do is you're chair of statutory abuse-related death reviews. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah, no worries. So domestic abuse-related death reviews have recently changed in terms of their name. So they were previously referred to as domestic homicide reviews. And these came into force under a statutory basis through the Home Office. And essentially, they are reviews wherever there has been a death. A local area is required to commission a review to really understand and try and learn the lessons from that death. So why has it happened, and how could we potentially prevent that in the future? These deaths obviously are domestic abuse related, but the reason that the name has changed from domestic homicide reviews to domestic abuse related death reviews is to really reflect, I suppose, the different ways that death can occur within a domestic abuse context. So they aren't just homicides, they're not just murder, manslaughter, but we'll also look at, on some occasions, unexplained deaths where there has been a history of domestic abuse, either within intimate partner relationships, but also more broadly in terms of domestic abuse where a death might occur within a family context. So a lot of those, for example, that I've undertaken have involved adult children killing parents, for example. But we also do reviews where there's been a death by suicide. And I think because of that name change in terms of domestic abuse related death reviews, we're seeing a lot more of those different death types, I think, coming through the statutory review process. But yes, as a chair of those reviews, essentially, it's my responsibility to oversee that review process. So when a death has occurred in a local area, they will commission an independent chair. And the independence is really important there to be able to add that kind of objectivity in terms of the review process and really challenge partners to reflect on what's happened and where they might have been able to do things differently. And we'll lead that kind of multi-agency process. So yeah, we're commissioned to, I've done 16 domestic abuse related death reviews to date.
Wow. And what sort of agencies would be involved with that?
It can be really broad. It depends on, it's very case by case. And it depends on the death type. So in some cases, the victim and the perpetrator and the broader family might have been known by quite a lot of agencies. So your usual players would be the police if there's been reported domestic abuse. It would be health services. So it might be that the victim, perpetrator, or children have disclosed to a GP. They've been to A&E potentially with injuries, an urgent care centre. It might be that they've told a midwife or a health visitor. So all of those kind of agencies would be involved. But more broadly, we would also include children's social care, adult social care. It might be probation, housing authorities. So it really could be any agency that have been involved with that family. But I think more difficult than that is the cases where perhaps there hasn't been a disclosure and agencies weren't aware that domestic abuse was happening. And those reviews really heavily rely on hearing from families to really understand actually why didn't we know and what can we learn there in terms of the accessibility of our services. Why hasn't that victim felt comfortable to disclose, and why as professionals have we missed potentially the signs there that actually abuse was happening.
I'm just wondering what a typical day for you at the workplace is, but a wider question than that for me is like, how many people like you are there doing this work, and what are your kind of areas and jurisdictions? Are there enough of you?
A really interesting question, because I suppose a typical day really does depend on the work that we're doing. But if I stick with the domestic abuse related death reviews and kind of what a typical day would look like, it might be useful just to start with a bit of context in terms of the review process. And my typical day would depend on where we are within that process. So when we're commissioned to undertake one of these reviews, one of the first things we do, similarly to the question Mark just asked in terms of which organisations might be part of it, is to try and understand and establish and scope what was known by who and when. So it might be that we will reach out to organisations within that local area and ask them to submit information on what contact they had, with who, and a bit of a chronology of that contact. And I use the term following breadcrumbs, talking about my experience in how I got into this, but it's a bit similar to that in terms of the review process. So as we get more information in, it might be that more agencies become involved in the process. So we might hear from children's social care that actually they had referred the family to a community and voluntary sector support organisation. So we'd follow those breadcrumbs until we reach the point where we think we know all of the different organisations that were involved. It's very much a multi-agency process. So we would have an initial panel meeting where all organisations would get together and we would set the terms of reference and the scope for the review. And that's really important in terms of the key learning questions. So based on what we know so far, what are our key learning questions here? What are we trying to uncover? What kind of questions do we want organisations to ask and reflect on themselves when they look at their contact with the victim or the family? So at that point, we would ask organisations to conduct their own, it's called an individual management review, and it's essentially a smaller review within the broader review where they will go away. Somebody independent within the organisation will review the contacts that they've had, and they will resubmit that in terms of what they think worked well, where there were gaps, and any recommendations that they would like to propose for changes moving forward. But throughout this process, we'll meet as a multi-agency panel, and I suppose where the magic happens really is we bring together all of those individual reviews and try to look at the interconnectedness across the piece and that broader kind of systems learning in terms of what did the information sharing across agencies look like, and kind of how did we all work together as a partnership? Did we all know the right information at the right time?
Yeah, where the gaps are. It's all about the gaps, isn't
Absolutely.
it? You know, who dropped the
Yeah.
ball, who didn't think it was serious. I was just going to ask you, where are you based?
So I am based in Northamptonshire,
Right,
but our associates are based across the country, and yeah,
right.
we operate nationally. So we'll take on a review. I've got some as far as Northumbria, and I've got some as I say far down as kind of Devon, Cornwall.
So a huge area. And I think for our
Mm.
listeners, could you just give us some statistics, please, of the current homicide rates that are currently known?
Yeah, of course. So the statistic, which sadly is 2 women will be killed a week due to domestic abuse, and that's not changed in since I've been working in this sector, which I think is real testament to why we need these reviews to try and move the needle on that.
Yeah.
But there has been a lot of research, particularly since domestic abuse related death reviews have been statutory, to really try and understand the true scale of death related to domestic abuse. And we're seeing that suicides related to domestic abuse are far outweighing that at the
Yeah.
moment.
Yeah, I saw that in your stats. It's quite staggering. I was just
Mm.
going to move on to asking you if you've ever used imaging in any of your investigations and your work that you've done in reviews. Have X-rays come along and helped your multi-agencies decide what actually happened?
No, it isn't something that really happens at the moment, and I think that's an area for kind of further development and exploration, really. The only information that we would tend to get in terms of the death investigation process would be information from the police in terms of their investigation, but that doesn't necessarily always include that kind of medical investigation.
Right.
Um, and aside from that, coroners all work differently across the country, as I'm sure you're aware.
Hmm.
So we get a different level of information depending on the area, but ordinarily all I will get is a coroner's verdict on the
I
cause of
see.
death, which is a very short sentence on what they think the cause of death was. And I think one of the really interesting areas for potential development is really working with medical professionals that have been involved in investigating the death from that perspective on actually prior injuries and whether or not there's
Yeah.
anything we could pick up in terms of that trail of abuse.
It must be very emotionally draining. How do you deal with that?
Since the pandemic, a lot of the work I do is also virtual and kind of remote. So a lot of these meetings, particularly the multi-agency meetings that I'll have, will be over Zoom or Teams. Family meetings generally are still in person, just to build that connection. But it does mean that self-care looks a little bit different as well. So I suppose from a really practical perspective, clinical supervision plays a big role in self-care and switching off in terms of some of the emotional baggage, I suppose, that comes with the role. But on a more day-to-day basis, it's really simple things like where I have got a meeting that I know is going to be emotionally kind of draining or difficult, timing that so that it's before lunch so you can go on a walk after and kind of switch off and recalibrate, or at the end of the day where you don't have to jump into another meeting straight away. And I think things like getting outdoors and trying not to sit in front of the screen all day, as though they sound very simple, I think they make a huge difference in terms of trying to shift your brain space from that really difficult conversation back into whatever task you're doing next. So yeah, there's that kind of top level clinical supervision, but then all the small things you do day to day that I think do make a difference.
Well, I was just going to follow on a bit about the welfare because, if we don't look after ourselves, we can't look after others. And you're dealing with some really, really, difficult scenarios, as we do as forensic radiographers in victim identification or some of the post-mortem work that we do. There are always a case that will stay with us. And I'm sure your degree in psychology probably helps to a certain degree. And it's about having insight as well. I'm just interested about the future of your type of work and any exciting projects, or how are we going to try and reduce the number of domestic violence, abuse, homicides and suicides? What's the future looking like?
I suppose in terms of the domestic abuse related death reviews, it mirrors, I suppose, what happened in terms of my career trajectory, in terms of working with individuals, then families, then that broader kind of systems. I think with the domestic abuse related death reviews, one of the things that we are looking to do this year is do a little bit more in terms of the thematic analysis. We've got quite a lot of reviews that are coming in, and we want to be a little bit more intelligent about how we pull out key themes that are coming up across those. And more broadly than that, and linked, I suppose, to your question about the emotional difficulties, we are doing a bit of self-funded research at the moment to understand in terms of other chairs and professionals that are involved in domestic abuse related death reviews. They often haven't got into the job they're doing thinking that they would ever have to sit on a panel hearing these types of things. It could be somebody that got into midwifery or health visiting, and then all of a sudden they're on a domestic abuse related death review panel. So we're wanting to try and really understand the emotional impact that domestic abuse related death reviews as a process has on other professionals. And what we would really like to do is develop some resources and approaches that are trauma informed so that these processes don't do harm to the people that are involved in them. We've focused a lot on families and how we involve them in a way that doesn't re-traumatize them, but we probably haven't given the same amount of thought nationally on what it means for the professionals who don't really work in the death space day to day, and how they can manage and make sure that they can participate in a way that protects them from vicarious trauma. So there are a couple of the things we've got coming up this year.
And learning from like the medical examiner systems, the systems already in place, and enhancing those, because people on the shop floor are often the experts. We as radiographers are the first to see often bruises, and we see signs, we see patients, frequent attenders, and it's everybody's responsibility to raise safeguarding. So right at the beginning, if the information isn't gathered or noticed, then you're at a loss to start with. So it's about educating staff really on the ground, and even like in your home life, like your next door neighbours screaming and shouting or something, there could be a problem there. So the intel is there. That has been absolutely fascinating. So thank you very much, Danielle. I'm just going to say that this now wraps up another episode of Beyond Death. But before we go, Mark, what have we learnt from Danielle today? Can you give us a quick summary?
Yeah, well, it's been a really fascinating discussion on a very difficult and emotional topic. But Danielle mentioned a couple of really key points. I think that the phrase I loved was "following breadcrumbs," because that's really so much about the forensic investigation that we do and the investigation of death. And it is all about piecing things together and looking at what happened in a particular instance. In this case, domestic abuse. And is there something we can learn from that, and then applying that to the development of policy and trying to prevent these incidents from occurring. So really, really important role, and really fascinating to learn about that process. And the other thing that I thought was really useful as well was the discussion about the fact that we have moved a lot of these things online, and a lot of work that we do now is done virtually solitary, and it's really important to have ways of coping with some of the difficult things that happen, because you're not got the colleagues around you. So some really great points, and really interesting to talk with you this morning, Danielle. Thank you.
Yeah, I absolutely totally concur with that. So if you enjoy our episodes, please follow us and rate our channel. And we're always keen to hear from you and any feedback from our listeners. So whilst that concludes today's conversation, remember, it's not the end, because there's always more beyond death.